Imagine a moment of calm amidst the everyday chaos, a moment when you can pause, breathe, and connect with your inner self. Stoic meditation is a powerful tool that can transform your life, and you can start practicing it right now. Did you know that Stoic philosophers believed that self-awareness is the key to true freedom? As Epictetus said, "It is not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters." Today, you will discover how to incorporate this practice into your routine, even if you have never meditated before. We will explore simple and accessible techniques that bring profound benefits to the mind and spirit. Plus, you will learn how these ancient teachings can apply to your daily life, helping you cultivate greater resilience and inner peace. Get ready for a deep dive into Stoic wisdom, with practical steps you can apply in just 10 minutes a day. Are you ready to change your perspective and embrace a new way of living? Let's embark on this journey together. Fundamental principles of Stoic meditation. The fundamental principles of Stoic meditation are the foundations that support this ancient practice. Acceptance, one of the core concepts of Stoicism, teaches us to recognize and accept circumstances beyond our control. This idea is especially relevant in times of uncertainty and adversity, where resisting the inevitable only leads to suffering. Meditating with a focus on acceptance helps us cultivate a calmer mindset, allowing us to face challenges with greater serenity. Another crucial principle is virtue, which for Stoics is the highest good. The practice of Stoic meditation invites us to reflect on our actions and intentions. While meditating, we are prompted to ask ourselves whether we are living according to our values and whether our actions are virtuous. This introspection not only promotes self-awareness, but also motivates us to act ethically and justly in our daily situations. Reason, in turn, is one of the pillars of Stoic thought. Stoics believe that reason distinguishes us as human beings and that we should use it to guide our decisions. During meditation, we can practice logic and critical analysis, reflecting on how our emotions and reactions align with reason. This mental exercise is a powerful tool to prevent impulsivity and despair from dominating us in times of crisis. These principles interweave, creating a solid foundation for the practice of Stoic meditation. Acceptance prepares us emotionally, virtue guides our actions, and reason helps us understand and interpret the world around us. Thus, Stoic meditation is not just a moment of quietude, but a profound exercise in self-understanding and personal growth. Through meditation, practitioners can internalize these principles, transforming them into habits that shape their way of living. By dedicating ourselves to this practice, we cultivate a more resilient mind and an open heart, ready to face life's inevitable storms with a new perspective. Basic techniques of Stoic meditation. For those beginning their journey in Stoic meditation, it is essential to know some basic techniques that can be easily incorporated into daily life. One of the most common practices is mindfulness meditation, which involves fully focusing on the present moment. By sitting in a quiet place, the practitioner should pay attention to their breath, observing each inhale and exhale. This technique helps calm the mind and brings clarity, allowing thoughts to flow without attachment. Another valuable technique is self-reflection on one's life and actions. During meditation, the practitioner can ask themselves, "Am I living according to my values?" Or "What actions today aligned with virtue?" These guided questions promote introspection and help identify areas for personal growth. This type of meditation should not be rushed. It is a sacred space to evaluate one's life with honesty and compassion. Additionally, visualization can be a powerful tool. Stoics often practiced what is called premeditatio malorum, which involves imagining adverse scenarios. While this may seem counterintuitive, this practice helps prepare the mind to face future challenges, reducing the fear of the unknown. By visualizing these situations, the practitioner can develop a sense of control and resilience. It is important to emphasize that Stoic meditation does not require long periods of practice. Beginners can start with sessions of 5 to 10 minutes, gradually increasing as they become more comfortable. The key is consistency. Even brief moments of meditation can have a significant impact on one's mindset and overall well-being. Regular practice of these techniques not only improves meditation skills, but also provides a deeper understanding of Stoic principles. Over time, practitioners will notice that meditation becomes a natural and essential part of their lives, helping them face life's ups and downs with a more balanced and centered attitude. Benefits of Stoic meditation. The benefits of Stoic meditation are wide-ranging and profound, impacting not only one's mental state, but also practical aspects of life. One of the primary benefits is emotional resilience. By practicing acceptance and reflection, individuals learn to cope better with adversities. This resilience does not mean the absence of negative emotions, but rather the ability to confront them without being overwhelmed. Meditation provides a safe space to process these emotions, allowing a person to return to their center. Self-awareness is another significant benefit. Through meditation, practitioners become more aware of their thoughts and emotions, which is fundamental to Stoic philosophy. This self-awareness enhances the ability to observe one's behaviors and reactions, leading to a more intentional life. When we understand what we feel and why we react in certain ways, we gain more control over our actions and decisions. Dealing with adversity becomes easier when one has a consistent meditation practice. Stoic meditation teaches us to view challenges as opportunities for growth, rather than insurmountable obstacles. This shift in perspective is vital for developing a positive mindset that is not just reactive, but proactive in seeking solutions. Stoics believe that difficulties are an inevitable part of life, and by meditating on this, we learn to accept and overcome them. Another notable benefit is the improvement of mental health. Studies show that meditation can reduce stress and anxiety levels, promoting a calmer and more balanced mental state. This is particularly relevant in modern society, where constant pressure can lead to emotional burnout. Regular practice of Stoic meditation helps cultivate an internal space of peace, where practitioners can mentally retreat when external tensions become overwhelming. Stoic meditation also fosters a mindset of gratitude. By reflecting on virtues and values, practitioners are encouraged to recognize and appreciate the good things in their lives, even during challenging times. This practice of gratitude not only enhances emotional well-being, but also strengthens interpersonal relationships, as those who are grateful tend to be more compassionate and generous towards others. Guided practice of Stoic meditation. The guided practice of Stoic meditation is an excellent way to start integrating this philosophy into your daily life. To begin, find a quiet place where you won't be interrupted. It's important that the environment is comfortable and that you feel at ease. Sit in a position that allows your spine to be straight, but relaxed. Close your eyes and start focusing on your breath. Inhale deeply through your nose and exhale slowly through your mouth. As you do this, allow your mind to quiet and begin preparing for reflection. Once you feel more centered, start bringing to mind a quote from a Stoic philosopher that resonates with you. For example, you might think of words from Seneca or Epictetus about the importance of accepting what cannot be controlled. Repeat this quote in your mind, allowing each word to carry weight and meaning. As you do this, observe how these ideas relate to the challenges you are currently facing. Allow this reflective process to help shape your perspective. After a few minutes of reflection, begin to think about a specific situation that is causing you stress or worry in your life. Ask yourself how a Stoic would approach this situation. What can you control, and what should you simply accept? This process of critical analysis is a powerful way to apply Stoic principles to your life. Allow the answers to these questions to arise naturally, without rush or pressure. After contemplating the situation, bring your attention back to your breath. Inhale deeply one more time, and as you exhale, visualize the release of tension and worry related to the situation you reflected on. Imagine that with each exhale, you are letting go of some of the weight you carry. This visualization can be an effective tool for helping to integrate the practice of meditation into your daily life. When you feel ready, start bringing your awareness back to the space around you. Gently move your fingers and toes. Slowly open your eyes and allow the light and life around you to come back into focus. Take a moment to reflect on the experience you had and how this practice can be repeated whenever you need clarity or inner peace. Incorporating meditation into daily routine. Integrating Stoic meditation into a daily routine can often seem challenging, especially in such a busy world. However, small changes can make a significant difference. The first step is to identify moments in your routine that can be dedicated to meditation. This might be first thing in the morning, during a lunch break, or before going to bed. The key is to choose a time when you can commit to spending a few minutes on this practice. A helpful strategy is to start with short periods of meditation, ranging from 5 to 10 minutes, and gradually increase the duration as you become more comfortable. You can use a timer or a meditation app to help keep track of time. The important thing is that even in these brief moments, you focus fully on your practice, allowing yourself space for reflection and acceptance. Over time, these short periods can become an essential part of your day. In addition to timing, the environment also plays a crucial role in meditation. Try to create a specific space in your home that is dedicated to meditation. This might be a quiet corner of a room, adorned with objects that inspire calm, such as plants, candles, or even images of Stoic philosophers. By associating this space with your practice, you'll find it easier to enter a meditative state whenever you sit there. Don't forget to be flexible in your approach. Sometimes life can be unpredictable, making it difficult to find the perfect time to meditate. In those moments, meditation can be adapted. For example, you might practice mindfulness meditation while walking, paying attention to each step and your breath. This flexibility is important for ensuring that the practice becomes a natural and enjoyable part of your life. Remember that Stoic meditation is not just about formal moments of practice. It's a philosophy that can be incorporated into every aspect of daily life. Throughout the day, take pauses to reflect on acceptance and virtue in your actions. Ask yourself if you are living according to Stoic principles. This ongoing integration of meditation into your daily life can bring about a profound transformation in how you view the world. Reflection and journaling in Stoic meditation. Reflective writing, or journaling, is a practice that wonderfully complements Stoic meditation. By putting your thoughts on paper, you give shape and clarity to emotions and ideas that may be confusing in your mind. After a session of meditation, take some time to jot down your reflections. Write about the emotions that arose, the insights you gained, and how you feel about the situations you explored during meditation. Furthermore, journaling can be a powerful tool for processing everyday events. At the end of each day, take a few minutes to reflect on your actions, choices, and feelings. Ask yourself if you acted in accordance with the Stoic principles of acceptance and virtue. This practice not only helps solidify the lessons learned during meditation, but also allows you to become more aware of your behavioral patterns and emotional responses. Another suggestion is to create a specific section in your journal for Stoic quotes that have impacted you. Over time, you can collect and revisit these quotes, reflecting on how they apply to your life. This practice not only enriches your understanding of Stoic philosophy, but also serves as a daily reminder of the principles you wish to incorporate into your life. Journaling can also be a way to express gratitude. At the end of each week, write about the things you are grateful for. This practice helps shift the focus of your mind, promoting a more positive and resilient perspective. By acknowledging the good things in your life, even amid challenges, you align more closely with the Stoic idea that happiness does not depend on external circumstances, but rather on how we interpret and respond to them. Consider revisiting your journaling entries regularly. This not only allows you to observe your progress over time, but also offers the opportunity to reflect on past learnings. You may discover patterns that you hadn't noticed before, helping to shape your future meditation practices and reflections. This integrated approach to meditation and journaling can enrich your journey into Stoic philosophy, promoting deeper self-awareness and a more conscious life. Developing self-awareness through meditation. Self-awareness is one of the fundamental pillars of Stoic philosophy, and meditation is a powerful tool for cultivating it. When we dedicate time to introspection, we have the opportunity to observe our thoughts and emotions without judgment. This practice allows us to recognize behavioral patterns and automatic reactions that often lead us to act impulsively. By becoming aware of these internal dynamics, we begin to have the ability to choose how to respond to them, rather than reacting instinctively. An effective technique for increasing self-awareness is mindfulness meditation, which involves focusing on your breath and observing the thoughts that arise. Over time, this practice helps create a space between thought and action, allowing emotions to be felt and processed before being externalized. This space is crucial, as it gives us the opportunity to assess whether our response aligns with our values and goals, something that Stoics greatly value. Moreover, self-awareness is not limited to recognizing our emotions. It also involves understanding how our actions affect others. During meditation, we can reflect on past interactions and consider the impact we had on those around us. This reflection not only helps us become more empathetic, but also gives us the chance to adjust our behavior in future interactions. Stoicism teaches us that virtue is essential, and being aware of the effects of our actions is a vital step toward living in accordance with that virtue. Another approach to developing self-awareness is self-analysis. After meditation, it can be beneficial to take some time to jot down the insights that emerge during the practice. Reflective questions like, what did I feel during meditation? What thoughts distracted me? Or, how can I apply this awareness in my daily life? Can guide this process. Journaling, which will be discussed in detail later, merges perfectly with meditation, creating a continuous cycle of reflection and learning. It is important to emphasize that self-awareness is an ongoing process. As we become more aware of ourselves, we can identify areas that need growth, as well as celebrate our achievements. Meditation offers us a safe space to explore these aspects of our lives, allowing for personal development that aligns with the Stoic principles of acceptance and virtue. Thus, the regular practice of meditation not only helps us better understand who we are, but also guides us on our journey to become more authentic and virtuous versions of ourselves.
Stoic inspiration. A quote from Marcus Aurelius. The quote by Marcus Aurelius, "The happiness of your life depends upon the quality of your thoughts," perfectly encapsulates the essence of Stoicism and the importance of meditation in this context. This quote reminds us that our perception and interpretation of the world around us are fundamental to our life experience. Meditation, therefore, becomes an essential practice for shaping and enhancing the quality of our thoughts.
In practice, this means that moments of meditation are not just an exercise in relaxation, but an opportunity to reprogram our minds. By focusing on our breath and allowing negative thoughts to arise and fade away, we begin to understand that we are not slaves to our emotions. This realization is transformative, as it gives us the freedom to choose how to react to challenges and adversities. Through meditation, we can cultivate a resilient mindset, which aligns perfectly with Stoic teachings. The quality of our thoughts is also closely linked to the stories we tell ourselves. During meditation, we can explore internal narratives that may be limiting us, such as self-critical beliefs or unfounded fears. By becoming aware of these narratives, we can question them and replace them with more empowering stories that align with our values. This is not merely a mental exercise, but an essential step toward creating a more fulfilling and conscious life. Additionally, the practice of meditation helps us develop a more balanced perspective on life. Marcus Aurelius emphasized the importance of accepting what we cannot control and focusing on our reactions. Meditation teaches us to observe difficult situations without succumbing to despair or frustration. By cultivating this skill, we can face adversities with a clearer mind and a calmer heart, reinforcing the idea that happiness is, indeed, a choice we make based on the quality of our thoughts. It is vital to remember that meditation is not a magic solution that resolves all problems. It is an ongoing commitment to self-awareness and self-improvement. As we practice, we begin to realize that happiness does not lie in external circumstances, but in the way we choose to interpret and respond to them. Marcus Aurelius's quote serves as a constant reminder that we are the architects of our own happiness, and meditation is a powerful tool that assists us in this constructive process. By incorporating Stoic meditation into your routine, you not only develop self-awareness but also create a space to reflect on your emotions and actions. Remember the words of Marcus Aurelius, "The happiness of your life depends upon the quality of your thoughts." By dedicating just 10 minutes a day, you open the doors to a new understanding of yourself and the world around you. Now imagine what your life would be like if you could face daily challenges with greater clarity and serenity. What habits could you change with this new perspective? Throughout the day, take a moment to practice mindfulness and reassess your thoughts. How about using this time to keep a journal? Recording your reflections can be a powerful tool for self-discovery. And if you encounter difficulties in your practice, don't be discouraged. Stoicism teaches us to embrace struggles as opportunities for growth. Ready to put into practice everything we've learned? How about starting your Stoic journey right now? Share in the comments how meditation is impacting your life, and don't forget to come back here for more valuable tips. The path of Stoicism is an invitation to transformation. Shall we embark on this journey together?